All right. Now we've seen the setup steps, the process steps, and the conclusion steps. Let's just tie it all together into a bow without actually doing any of the math just yet, because it's later. Anyway, if we want to run a hypothesis test, there are a couple different processes we can use. We'll see variants of this as we're going, but as far as I'm concerned, these are the main 7 steps to follow. So, first, we state the claim and identify the hypotheses we're working from. Then, we specify our level of significance alpha. Usually this is something that we're given for our purposes, but in reality, you would want to pick this for yourself. Then you determine the distribution and sketch it. You know roughly what you're going to be working with. We'll see a couple different variations, but mostly we'll see things with the standard normal and t-distribution. Then you calculate the test value and put that in the sketch somewhere. From there, you either find the p-value, that's the one I prefer, or you can do stuff with the critical value and alpha. Either gets you to kind of the same place, and we'll see a little of both. Then from there, you make your decision, and you interpret that result. Where that make a decision part, that's do you reject the null hypothesis, do you not reject the null hypothesis, and the interpretation is that subtle bit that I talked about with regards to whether you say you have evidence to reject, whether you don't have evidence to reject, whether you have evidence to support, whether you don't have evidence to support, where really what that comes down to is a matter of what your claim is. So if you want to think about this in terms of something like a flowchart, the first step we have to think about in terms of our final decision is what exactly are we claiming? Are we claiming something in terms of the null? Or are we claiming something in terms of the alternative? That's not how you write null. It's a silly mistake. But if we're claiming something in terms of the null, then we have to determine, well, did we reject it? Where if we reject the null, answer to that question is yes, then you can say something like we have evidence to reject the claim. And you want to be a bit more picky, you could say we have enough evidence to reject the claim at level of significance, blah, 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 that blah, blah, blah happens. On the other hand, if you fail to reject, that is, we do not reject the null hypothesis, then we don't have enough evidence. Or we say we have evidence that fails to reject, but you just say something like, not enough evidence to reject. So the big thing here is when your claim is the null hypothesis, your language is inherently going to be a lot more negative, as it were, because you're either rejecting or you're failing to reject. On the other hand, when you're talking about the alternative, your final decision is still interpreted in terms of whether or not you reject that null hypothesis, but whether or not you reject that null hypothesis kind of changes your verbiage if you're claiming the alternative. Still, though, it comes from the same kind of place. If you reject, then you say you have evidence to support. In particular, the claim. I'll probably want to write claim down here too, just to be sure. Where saying that you have evidence to support is very similar, kind of, to this rejection stuff. And like I said, there's subtlety there, but this is fundamentally what you have. If you're rejecting the null, you're kind of supporting the alternative. And then on the other hand, our final option, if you don't reject the null, then similarly you have not enough evidence, but in this case it's not enough to support the claim. And exactly how you word this, again, there's room for variation depending on what language you want to use, what language you're given, but this is fundamentally the set of choices. You can reject a null hypothesis that you are claiming, in which case you've got evidence to reject your claim. That's pretty direct. You can reject the null when you're claiming the alternative, which means you have evidence to support the alternative, that is, you have evidence to support your claim. Again, pretty clear. Or if you don't reject the null and you're claiming the null, then you don't have enough to reject. And if you're claiming the alternative, don't reject the null, you're not quite rejecting the alternative, you're just not having enough to support it. So you say there's not enough evidence in that flavor. And I've said a lot. And these are long videos. They're longer than I normally like these to be. But again, this section is really vitally important in terms of being able to get your grounding for how most of the rest of the semester is going to run. You don't need to have it perfect the first time you see it, but this is stuff that I would highly recommend coming back to as you're working on these problems, just to be able to remind yourself of what some of these general steps are, how they work, how they come together, and what you're ultimately trying to do. But this is it for the build-up. Now we're finally going to get to do some actual testing, which I'm sure is very exciting. You get to be tested on testing. Isn't that just great? We're going to do that starting with our next section here, looking at running these kinds of tests for means. We're going to make some assumptions that aren't quite realistic, but, well, we'll talk about that when we get into 7.2. I'll see you there.